Last week, U.S. President Donald Trump announced tariffs to be imposed on steel and aluminum imports, as he announced on Twitter on March the 5th. His reason was to protect our country, we must protect American steel. Since his announcement, U.S. allies and trading partners have roiled.
Up to hundreds of anti-dumping and anti-subsidy measures that the United States imposed on most of the imported steel and aluminum products did overprotect its domestic goods. If countries around the world all follow the step of the U.S., it will definitely inflict serious impacts to the international trade order.
Canada would view any trade restrictions on Canadian steel and aluminum as absolutely unacceptable. We will always stand up for Canadian workers and Canadian businesses. Should restrictions be imposed on Canadian steel and aluminum products, Canada will take appropriate, responsive measures to defend our trade interests and our workers.
It is deeply regrettable that President Donald Trump announced his plans.
This announcement is disappointing. The imposition of a tariff like this will do nothing other than distort trade, and ultimately, we believe, will lead to a loss of jobs.
There are several ways we can react. What's important is that the reaction be quick and resolute, and that the European steel market does not have to foot the bill for this American protectionism.
We strongly regret this step, which appears to represent a blatant intervention to protect U.S. domestic industry and not to be based on any national security justification.
Strong repercussions indeed. With that being said, does all of this spell a forthcoming potential trade war? What repercussions could this spell for China and consequentially the U.S.? And what can we foresee ahead from past trade wars for our integrated global economy now facing provincialization? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Professor Jiang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, and Mr. Timothy Stratford, the managing partner of Covington and Berlin LLP. Also, he was the former assistant U.S. trade representative for China affairs. We shall also be joined via satellite from Bern, Switzerland, by Mr. Vox Day, author of the book On the Question of Free Trade and Economic Discourse. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Gentlemen, do you think this is a blessing or curse for the U.S. economy in the first place when President Trump announces that he's going to impose punitive tariffs on steel and aluminum?
Usually what happens when you impose these sorts of measures is you're trying to protect one particular industry, but often the overall cost to the economy are great. I remember a number of years ago the U.S. imposed tariffs on Chinese tires, and a study afterwards showed that apparently for every U.S. job the measure preserved in the tire industry, it cost American consumers $800,000 per year in more expensive tires. So it's hard to argue that it's a good thing for the economy overall. You just have to decide whether a particular industry is so important that you want to protect it.
So, John, eventually, do you think this is a political decision or an economic one?
No, it's definitely a political decision. I want to add another example. In 1992, George Bush also made a political decision to impose tariff on steel imports. And there was a study after that that shows that there are actually 200,000 jobs lost in the downstream industries of the steel sector. And very quickly, George Bush, under pressure, withdrew that tariff. So I think, if you look at the landscape here, the picture here, the only few companies benefit from this. They are mostly steel companies, but the downstream companies that are going to buy steel, process steel. This is an industry that is dominated by small and medium-sized companies. 95% of that sector are composed of companies with employees less than 500 people. And that sector is going to suffer. The price is going to rise, and the price rise is going to have repercussions on all the downstream industries, as steel is used so permeatingly in the economic sectors.
The latest development from the European Union shows that the EU trade representative, a lady, has delivered a soft warning to their American ally. Look, if you're going to impose punitive tariffs, we'll defend our EU interests. That means the outbreak of hostilities in trade, or it should be called a trade war. So what do you think of the strong repercussions from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean?
I think these are foreseeable. I think that it's not a surprise that Europe has reacted this way. Frankly, the repercussions are not just international. I think that President Trump's decision was very controversial. Apparently his top economic advisor has just resigned because of this decision, and you have the Speaker of the House, who's also from President Trump's party, also strongly criticizing the decision. And so I think the United States itself believes that it's a difficult decision, and I think there were repercussions domestically as well as internationally.
It's actually not just Gary Cohn. You know, it was reported that Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, as well as Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, both are opposed to this, and they raised the issue that this can impair the relationship with the American allies. So it's a national security issue. But apparently, you know, Donald Trump made this decision aside from the advice from these two very important executive members of his cabinet. So I'm really puzzled why he is so much influenced by these two or three people, you know, Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, and Peter Navarro, you know, who's come from nowhere, I guess. He was not recognized and not, you know, he represents a very fringe view in the economics community. The economists sort of push him aside, and nobody agrees with him.
So I think part of the answer to that is that in many respects this is a symbolic decision, and what do I mean by that? I think President Trump was elected because he recognized a strong sense of dissatisfaction in the U.S. population, similar to what other countries are seeing in their own population, where people believe that trade has simply not benefited them and they want to see something different. Just for example, if you look at the last 10 years and you look at the top 25 economies in the world, 550 million people in those economies have seen their incomes either stagnate or decline. And so there is a sense that something has not been working right. President Trump recognized that, and so therefore he's trying to show that he's responding. Now we can debate about whether this is the best response, but I think we can understand the political mood that he's trying to respond to.
Yeah, right. Follow-up questions about this is actually the driving force behind the political decision. Now, does it mean he keeps one eye on the announcement of imposing punitive tariffs and keep the other on the upcoming presidential elections or even the midterm elections in the first place? So it aims to win them.
You're asking whether he's a politician, and I think the answer is yes.
Well, he's a very good politician. On this note, you know, he has done a tremendously successful job in keeping his campaign promises. Look at what he has done. He said he's going to move his embassy to Jerusalem. He said he's going to kill the TPP. He's not going to sign the Paris Accord. He did all of these things. So he delivered every single of these things as he promised during his campaign. And I think this latest decision, it just reflects his you know, this line of thinking. And he is answering to his political base in the state of Pennsylvania. You know, they have a huge steel mills in Pittsburgh, in Bethlehem, Allentown, Pennsylvania. So he's actually answering to his political base.
Well, netizens and viewers in their millions are very familiar with the tweets of President Trump. Let me cross over to Mr. Dave Vox, Vox Day, author of The Unquestion of Free Trade and Economic Discourse, for his comments on the latest. Hello.
Hello.
What do you make of the impact of the European Union in the first place?
Well, I think that the threats from the European Union are essentially toothless. There's very little that the European Union can do when it comes to U.S. trade policy. And so I think that it's a lot of political threat, but ultimately there's nothing they can do about it.
You mean there won't be any reprisals from the European Union? let's look at such statistics. The exports as a percentage of each economy, Germany is 46%, South Korea 42%, Mexico 38%, and Canada 31%. China is just 20%, but we are still very much exposed compared to 12%. So
right.
all would suffer in a trade war if there would be a trade war. What do you think of the collective repercussions?
Well, first of all, I think that it's important to understand that not everyone will suffer equally in a trade war, and some parties will benefit from it. For example, if you simply look at the United States alone, and we take it to the most extreme, absurd example, and we imagine that the United States were to stop all imports and exports, that would immediately translate into a 3% annual boost to the U.S. economy. If you look at how the GDP is calculated, it's very simple. And so the fact that it might have a negative outcome on Europe, or the fact that it might have a negative outcome on South Korea, says nothing about what the impact on the United States is. And of course, President Trump has made it very clear that with his America First policy, he is not as concerned with the economic state of the rest of the world.
Well, Timothy, what do you make of the differences, if any, between free trade and fair trade? President Trump says in what amounts to a threat to his European allies that if you defend European products and decide to retaliate, then we're going to stop your sales of automobiles to the U.S. market. And he says that the Europeans' cars are pouring into the U.S. market freely, and that will be stemmed. The tidal waves must be stemmed. What do you think of his threat?
The idea of fair trade is
I think they're very serious. I think they're very credible.
Okay, the threat is very credible. So, Timothy, what do you think?
Well, I think there would be a lot of disruption to supply chains. I think that right now a lot of products are made in different parts of the world and then assembled in different parts of the world, and if you disrupt that, then I think the actual dislocations in trade would be quite significant. So I think when we talk about campaign promises of President Trump, one campaign promise that he made that sort of is notably absent so far in terms of addressing is all the things he said about China. He originally proposed perhaps a 45% tariff on all imports from China, and he proposed a lot of other things. And I think that this is very much on his mind, and I think that the steel and the aluminum measures that we're discussing tonight have very little impact on China. Only 2% of the steel imported by the United States comes from China, and only 0.1% of Chinese steel is exported to the U.S. And it's also rather low on the aluminum side. So this current action hasn't really focused on the principal target of the U.S. concerns on trade, and that's China. So I think that what's happening in Europe is partly because there's been a lot of interest in steel traditionally by President Trump and by Secretary Ross. But I think that what we really need to be looking ahead toward is what is the administration planning to do for China, because this particular action is not really targeted China at all.
I have a good answer for this. China, of course, is on his mind, but I think Donald Trump's approach to China is very much also in line with Chinese government's desire, that is through negotiation. I brought a report here. I want to read it to you, actually. I think Donald Trump and our President Xi has a very good relationship. Personal relationship, rapport, very good relationship. And this is what he said during a press conference when Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull visited the U.S. And it was actually not widely reported in the Western press. This is something I want to quote. He said, yes, we have developed a great relationship with China, close probably than we have ever had, he said. And my personal relationship, as Malcolm can tell you, he's the Australian Prime Minister, with President Xi is, I think, quite extraordinary. He's somebody that I like, and I think he likes me. With that being said, he likes China, and I like the United States, but a lot of things are happening. It's going to be a very interesting period of time, but we have to straighten out as much as I like and respect President Xi, and we have to straighten out the trade imbalance. There might be tough negotiations ahead, but there's no war against China. That's what he said in the press release just a few days ago.
But obviously, national interest is not based on personal chemistry or personal relationship. And therefore, do you think he is a very shrewd businessman and he does the deals with China in a transactional manner?
That I totally agree. It's not based on a personal relationship. But the thing is that this is, China and the U.S. and particularly Donald Trump love to have negotiations. Right now, our Mr. Liu He, he's still in Washington, D.C., discussing with American
Given the limited impact on China and the trade with the United States, do you believe that China would deliberately keep a low profile instead of turning to high-profile reprisals in the trade war?
China's not going to do anything, in my opinion, to initiate reprisal actions. And as a matter of fact, we are already starting to do things to address his concerns. For example, Liu He already announced, and it's also in the already announced in the
By the way, Liu He is a member of the Politburo, a very influential and important decision-making body politically for China.
Exactly.
He's also chief economic advisor
to President Xi. Yeah, what he said is very important. Premier Li Keqiang's government report during the NPC session. So what he said, we are going to open more in our financial market. Guess what? We're doing this for who, right? So open our financial market means increasing imports in the service sector. And primary beneficiary of this action is going to be the United States, American financial institutions and banks. We're also going to increase imports in other ways. I just know that China is going to hold its biggest import exhibition. Have you heard about import exhibition? No country in the world will try to promote imports. It's going to be held in November this year, later in Shanghai. So I think China is doing all kinds of things to address this $300 billion trade surplus with the United States.
Yeah, I think I see things. I understand what China is trying to do, and I think that China has responded to a lot of the relatively harsh rhetoric coming out of the United States with in a very measured way. So I think that's good. However, I do think that we're going to see a different approach from the United States than we've seen in the past. Though we talk about President Trump as someone who wants to negotiate, it's also true that the principal channel for this negotiation was the comprehensive economic dialogue that President Xi and President Trump established at Mar-a-Lago. And that meeting basically ended in failure, and the U.S. announced that it was going to discontinue the dialogues for the foreseeable future. And what I hear from my former colleagues in the U.S. government when I visit Washington is that the U.S. does not wish to spend a lot of time negotiating more because they believe that the previous negotiators were not successful, that China sort of played them. President Trump said that whoever was negotiating with China on behalf of the U.S. government was very, very, very stupid, and I used to be in charge of that. So I understand the process. And now what you hear from the Trump administration is, we don't want to have endless dialogues. We have particular things that need to be done, and it needs to happen very quickly, or there are going to be
Excuse me, let me cross over to Vox Day, author of On the Question of Free Trade. Hello, Vox. What do you think of the Chinese response? What would be the most likely response from China, which was accused by the U.S. government of only paying lip service instead of turning to actions to reciprocate deals that are not quite in favor of the U.S.? By the way, the United States, according to President Trump, suffers $800 billion trade deficit. That's a lot.
Well, I think I agree with the previous commenter. I think that China's response is going to be very calm and measured. I don't think that there is any advantage to China in trying to engage in reprisals, simply because, by definition, the reduction of imports into the U.S. is going to boost their manufacturing and boost their GDP, and so the best thing for China to do is to simply play a long game, play a waiting game. It's something that they're very good at. This main steel and aluminum tariff is not directed primarily at China, and so there's no reason for China to overreact. Trump will do what he says he's going to do. He's pretty good about that.
But last year we enjoyed a
base,
trade surplus of up to
action.
$300 billion with the United States. And John, the guest speaker here in the Beijing studio, says that China is likely to open up our capital market and to pave the ground, to lay the groundwork for more of the American services to be provided here in the Chinese market. What do you think of these prospects, Marx?
Well, I don't think that that is going to be as effective a way, because Trump is not that concerned about Wall Street. He's not that concerned about what you call the services market. He's much more concerned about the industrial base. He's much more concerned about the working class who've lost so many jobs over the last few decades. I think that the most important aspect of that development that you're talking about is that it indicates China is not disposed to responding to Trump's harsh rhetoric with harsh rhetoric and ill-considered actions of their own.
Yeah, I want to address two things. One is your Tim's issue about negotiation. I understand that the 100-day negotiation is a total failure, and I think Mr. Liu He's sort of trip to Washington D.C. is really a last-minute effort to sort of save negotiation. I think he is prepared to bring a lot of things to the table to finally save this negotiation moving forward. Now back to the previous speaker's comments about that concern about Wall Street. The purpose is not like that. I mean, look at the U.S. economy. It's 80% service economy, and there are things that America is running out of to sell to China. There's a limit as to how many soybeans we can buy. There's a limit as to how many airplanes we can buy, how many automobiles we can buy, beef we can buy. And the solution to this trade imbalance is really in service trade. That's where the U.S. economy shines, in areas like education, tourism, financial services, engineering services. These are the things that can help rebalance the trade balance the trade deficit with China. And I think it's coming from that perspective that is so important that China needs to open up the service sector so that American companies come in and help rebalance the trade deficit.
There's no question about the appeal of American service industry, but China is most interested, however, in imports of high-tech products. In this particular area, I'm afraid the United States is not ready yet.
No, it's
well, I think China's also interested in the import of high technology that can be incorporated in Chinese manufacturing base. I agree that we can't focus on trade deficits as the ultimate measure of whether the trade relationship is working, and I think there are a lot of systemic reasons why that's the case. However, we can't just focus on whether the Chinese market is open either and say that that will solve the problems between our economies, because what the U.S. is most concerned about are the subsidies and the industrial policies and other things that are bringing manufacturing to China that under other conditions would be in the United States and other countries. And therefore, if we just focus on opening up the Chinese economy and don't look at the industrial policies and the way they're moving investment flows and jobs, and that's the thing that's most distortive, we won't be able to solve the underlying problem. Remember, the problem in the United States is people losing jobs, people seeing their standard of living go down, and opening up the Chinese market but not creating opportunities for jobs in the U.S. is not going to solve the problem. So we need to look at China's industrial policy. I was very encouraged when Liu He was in Washington. I saw some reports that the U.S. talked with him about eliminating subsidies to state-owned enterprises and doing other things that would have a much deeper and more profound systemic impact on making the economies more balanced. I don't know how far China is willing to go on that, but that's really what we need to be looking at.
I totally agree with you. I mean, in these areas, China has a lot of room to improve. They're going to gradually phase out these subsidy measures. But the problem is that these things take some time to realize, to materialize. So, I don't know if Washington is patient enough to wait to see those measures, the things that you talk about, to unfold and realize in the future. It probably takes several years.
I agree that Washington's not going to be patient right now.
He's not going to be patient. When he says fair and reciprocal trade, in his mind it's balanced trade.
When President Trump said on the campaign trail that he would put America first, it means automatically, perhaps, that American patience is over with many things like North Korea, climate change, NAFTA, TPP, everything. You mentioned it. Let me go to Vox Day for his comments on the future of NAFTA. President Trump accused his predecessors of making stupid mistakes. As a result, Americans have suffered $800 billion of trade deficit almost annually. So what do you think of his negotiation ploy to use the issue of a trade imbalance for renegotiating NAFTA with Canada and Mexico? Minister of International Trade from Canada and politicians in Mexico both made it very clear that they would not allow the U.S. government to hurt their economy, respective economy. What do you think of the war of attrition?
I think that the Trump administration's long-term goal is to get rid of NAFTA altogether. NAFTA is extremely unpopular in the United States. The negative effects of it have actually been worse than its enemies predicted. And none of the benefits that were promised to Americans have been delivered to them. And so I think that, again, the threats or the posturing of the Mexican and Canadian governments is almost completely irrelevant. Trump's made it very clear that he understands his focus is on the American working class and finding jobs, finding manufacturing jobs. That's why the services perspective that you mentioned with regards to China is really just a tactical measure. It wouldn't solve, it may solve the issue from the economist's point of view, but it doesn't solve it from the President Trump's point of view or from the point of view of the American people. And so I don't think that that is, I agree with the gentleman who said that that's not a long-term solution. It's not, because it doesn't meet the goals that have been expressed by the President.
I don't think the goal of the administration is to scrap NAFTA. I will be very surprised if that happens. But I do think that that President Trump and his team are trying to emphasize things that they think have not gone well for the United States. But I think the negotiations will continue to be very tough. I hope they're successful. But my expectation is that they won't end in failure such that NAFTA will be scrapped.
Probably President Trump has been barking at the wrong tree. If you look at reasons behind the huge trade deficit of $800 billion US dollars. Now, what's wrong with the U.S. economy when China is accused of manipulating the currency and outsourcing American jobs? At the same time, our way of looking at the thing shows clearly that it is the multinationals from the United States that benefited most from our trade surplus with the United States. We contributed up to 30% to the world economic recovery, and yet China comes under fire. So what do you think of the structural problems that President Trump faces?
Yeah, well, this is a long-term trend. I mean, it's in history, it's not like this hasn't happened before. Historically, manufacturing has been moving from Europe down to North America, and from North America to Japan, to Asia, to Japan, to South Korea, and then to China. But even today, China manufacturing is moving out of China as well. So this manufacturing moving, from different countries to different countries is nothing new. So I think his idea of taking manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. is very difficult. At least it's not going to happen.
The tax reform may help.
Yeah,
thank you so much, gentlemen. Time is up. Yes, indeed, we need to watch out and figure out what's going to happen next with punitive tariffs and tax reform, whether multinationals are likely to relocate their R&D centers from China and other low-income economies in Asia back to their homeland. We'll see what's going to happen next. I thank you so much for being with us. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.